this is sort of odd because I have to introduce a person that does not need an introduction. So you know the brilliant scholar activist that Frances Fox Piven is, but I'll also sort of introduce you differently by saying that she is a lovely colleague and an amazing friend. And for those of you who are grad students in the business and sort of junior professors, it's always a blessing to have a guiding light like Frances Fox Piven in your life. So you all know how brilliant she is, but now I'm telling you just how wonderful a person she really is and how much of a privilege it is to have her to close this conference. Frances Fox Piven. Thank you.
Listen, it's been a very long day. I'm amazed at your tenacity. Both sat here, listened, spoken, but it's been a very good day. And I want to thank Michael and the other people who have worked with him on this event, on the quality of the conference, but also especially on organizing a conference that cast urban violence in a different light than the traditional light. Because ordinarily when we think about urban violence, we think about the poor people, the young people, the males, men, the minorities, who are presumably the perpetrators of violence. But Michael and his colleagues, by naming the conference a study of urban violence and state and local policy, made it clear that we were to look beyond the people who were presumably the perpetrators of violence. But then, as the day progressed, I think we made progress of a different kind, that in a sense, our understanding of urban violence was continually expanded by the different contributions. So that first we went from poor young minority men as the perpetrators to an understanding, very familiar, of poor young minority men as the targets of violence, as the victims of violence. And then we began to consider the public policies which allow poor minority young men which facilitated the victimization of these populations. But then I think our insight got a little bit different and a little bit broader, partly because of Paul Jargowski's comments when he began to talk about the public policies which patterned the community development of cities and ghettos, which narrowed opportunities, public policies which are rooted in federal policy but are also state and local policies, and which, at the same time as state and local policies, are so important in creating the structures of the carceral state. So we go from perpetrators of violence to victims of violence to a focus on public policies, and a focus on public policies also always means a focus on politics, because it's politics that shapes public policies. But then I'm going to introduce still another window onto this tangle of events that we're trying to analyze. I want us to consider that young black men and Hispanic men are not only the perpetrators of violence, and sometimes they are the perpetrators of violence. They're not only the victims of violence, and they're definitely the victims of the carceral violence of the carceral state. But I think in recent months, we've seen these populations go from being victims to being political agents that can help shape the public policies that we have agreed are so important in structuring and enabling the carceral state. We have, and this is such a dramatic moment, I want to shake each and every one of you. Don't you realize that we are at an early stage in another era of movements from the bottom of American society? Can't you see that all around you? The movements of young people, of poor and working class young people, of poor and working class minority young people, the movements of immigrants. This is a huge opening. It's the fight for 15, economic injustice. It's the Black Lives Matter. It's the Dreamer movement. It was Occupy. You all want a romance about the 1930s and the 1960s? Well, go ahead. Those are very interesting periods, but you're in a very interesting period. This is a huge opening. And our nation and our world is going to change. It has to change. It may not change in just the way we anticipate or in just the way we plan, but it's going to change. Now, why these movements now? You know, the sociologists in particular, but other social scientists as well, including even geographers, all have theories about why protest movements emerge. But, you know, binding all those theories together, underlying all of them, is the idea that people rise up. They rise up in indignation when the promises that their society, that their communities, their families, their kin have made to them are broken. Sometimes it's called frustration aggression. Sometimes it's called relative deprivation. It's given different names, but that's always a key element. There are other elements too that shape movements having to do with the specificities of the history and the experience of the people who are in motion. But broken promises are very, very important in the youth movements across the world today. And the promises are broken by the austerity regimes imposed by neoliberal capitalism. But it's not only disappointment. Movements also, what does it say? She prepared it. She could not. Movements are not just frustration, aggression, and disappointment. They contain those things. But movements only arise if people also have a sense that they have some power and they have some hope. And you know, I think the sources of that hope and that sense that they have the crowds chanting Black Lives Matter, the sense that they have some power, the sources of that are worth speculating about, worth noting. You know, about half a century ago, a historian named Eugene Genovese wrote a history of slavery in the United States. And that was his best book. After that, he went bad. But in that book, he made a point about the different pattern of black settlement in the New World that resulted from the slave system in South America and the West Indies, in contrast to the slave system in the United States. He said that in, for example, Brazil and Jamaica, the plantations were huge. As a consequence, the workforce, the slave workforce brought to these plantations and settled on these plantations was big. They were congregated in villages. But in the United States, the plantations tended to be smaller and the slave holdings smaller. Genovese said 20 slaves on average per holding. And that lack of concentrated population weakened American slaves politically, so that the slave rebellions were few. Many of those that did occurred mainly in the paranoid imagination of white slaveholders. By contrast, in Brazil and in Jamaica, the slave resistance movements were very big and had a very big effect on their societies. Now, in the 20th century, and as was evident from the 1930s and 1960s, blacks moved from the plantations. They were no longer dispersed. They were concentrated in cities, first in the South, and then in the North and in the West. And as those concentrations grew, so did black movements begin to emerge, along with other working class movements in the United States. My point is only this, that residential concentration, I'm talking to you, Paul, residential concentration is a resource, a political resource for movements. Place matters in that sense. Whatever else may be true, and we could argue about the different particulars that we all have in our mind when we make our arguments, residential concentration has been a key resource to black political resistance in the United States, in part just because of concentration and proximity, but also because of the political power in the electoral representative system based on geography. Both things matter. So there are reasons that the movements are arising. It's an important moment. I said that already. But what I want to close with is a reminder to you all of the importance that we too matter. We academics also matter in this. Our work plays a role. Look, you heard about it all day today. The academics who advanced broken windows, legitimated the carceral state. Do you need more evidence than that? Or the academics that legitimated welfare reform, so-called reform, legitimated a system of assistance which slashed assistance for cut two-thirds of the people who were getting assistance off the rolls, or the academics who legitimated an unfettered market, international market, and treated financial markets as somehow magically able to correct themselves, bringing disaster on the economies of many countries. Academics matter. And academics who have different perspectives, who have dissenting perspectives, who ally themselves with excluded and marginalized groups also matter. So our work is important. We should pursue it. I want to thank the Murphy Institute for holding this conference, and I want to thank all of you for contributing to it.